They told me to ask my daughter for money. My own son had 12 million pounds sitting safely in a private investment account. Yet his mother instructed me to go ask the school teacher instead. That is the kind of cruel, clinical sentence that settles deep within your chest like a stone you have swallowed whole, a heavy weight that refuses to dissolve no matter how many hours pass. I did not utter a single word in retaliation against Eleanor that night. 58 years old, broken by decades of unyielding labor, and I simply sat there at the kitchen table in absolute silence, absorbing the bitter realization that my entire existence had been reduced to an inconvenient utility bill. Before I reveal the full architecture of how we arrived at that desolate moment, you must understand something fundamental about the nature of my narrative. This is not merely a tale about currency or commercial fortunes. It is a profound exploration of human endurance, of who genuinely stands beside you when your pockets are completely empty and you have nothing left on earth to offer them. Allow me to retrace my steps and establish the reality of my daily existence. I reside in a modest, 3-bedroom detached house situated just off the A61 in the affluent spa town of Harrogate, North Yorkshire. It is the sort of property a young man purchases when he is foolishly optimistic, genuinely believing he will eventually expand it into a grand estate as his enterprise prospers. That grand expansion never materialized. The white exterior paint is peeling in long, curling strips along the wooden porch rails, and I have spent the better part of 2 years intending to repair the sagging iron gutter on the east elevation, though the harsh Yorkshire winters always manage to interrupt my plans. It was a Tuesday evening in late July, the ambient air thick and stifling, holding on to the residual warmth of summer long after dusk had settled over the district. I was seated at our polished kitchen table, staring blankly at a small stack of correspondence I lacked the emotional energy to open. At the very top lay a bright red final demand notice from British Gas, threatening immediate disconnection. Beneath it rested a thick envelope from our insurance underwriters, carrying that unmistakable corporate bulk which invariably signals unpleasant news, because financial institutions rarely dispatch good tidings in heavy packaging. Suddenly, Eleanor's mobile phone chimed brightly from its charging station on the granite kitchen counter. I watched her entire facial structure undergo a dramatic transformation. Her features shifted as though an unseen hand had abruptly flipped a switch behind her eyes, banishing the perpetual weariness she usually wore around me. There it is, I thought to myself with a quiet, hollow ache. The only genuine smile I am permitted to witness anymore, and it is not even directed toward her husband of 31 years. "Julian, darling," she practically sang into the receiver, her voice dripping with an affectionate warmth I had not heard in decades. "Oh my goodness, tell me everything. How did the commercial acquisition finalize?" I deliberately set my coffee mug down upon the scarred wooden surface, making just enough sound to signal my presence. "Is that Julian? Let me say hello to him briefly." She did not even deign to glance in my direction. Instead, she turned her back entirely, actually pivoting her physical body as though I were an intolerable, freezing draft blowing through an unsealed window that she needed to block out, and drifted away toward the sitting room, eager to hoard every syllable of our son's success in private isolation. A 12 million pound corporate valuation? Julian, that is extraordinary. I am so profoundly proud of you, darling. I truly am. You know, you inherited that razor-sharp business acumen straight from my side of the family. Your grandfather could sell ice to an Eskimo in the dead of winter. God rest his soul. I remained seated at that table, quietly listening to the woman I had married and cherished for over 3 decades fawn over our son as though he had single-handedly cured an incurable medical affliction, rather than merely executing a standard corporate sales contract. I am recounting this not to indulge in petty bitterness, but because it represents the absolute, unfiltered truth. You must comprehend the exact baseline of normality within my household before you can grasp the cataclysmic events that followed. She eventually terminated the conversation, her face still illuminated by a lingering, radiant smile. She walked back into the kitchen, and the moment her eyes locked onto mine, That artificial smile vanished instantly, as though she were hastily peeling off a theatrical mask she no longer needed to wear. "He is doing exceptionally well, Arthur," she remarked flatly, her tone devoid of warmth. "That is genuinely good to hear," I replied, and I meant it with all sincerity. Whatever deep emotional chasms had opened between that boy and myself over the years, I never once harbored malice or wished misfortune upon his path. Eleanor offered no further conversational overtures. She simply reached out and slid the menacing British gas utility bill across the polished table directly toward me, as though issuing a summons. She did not inquire whether I was holding up under the strain. She did not ask about the deep, rattling cough I had suppressed for 3 consecutive weeks, which I repeatedly blamed on the pervasive North Yorkshire damp. "Fix this utility crisis," she demanded coldly. "Please, before they cut the electrical supply off again," she said again, as though my systemic failures were an established calendar event, as though I were the sole architect of every hardship we faced. But little did she know, the ledger of our lives was about to undergo a reckoning far more absolute than any utility bill could ever provoke. To comprehend the heavy silence that now defines my household, one must journey backward across the desolate landscape of the past decade, returning to a time when my name still carried weight in the local commercial markets. 10 years ago, I was not a weary warehouse operative smelling of diesel exhaust and cardboard boxes. I was a modest, independent property investor operating across the North Yorkshire region. Nothing extraordinarily grandiose, but I possessed a sharp, reliable instinct for spatial development and municipal expansion. I had successfully acquired 60 acres of raw, undeveloped land, situated just beyond the historic market town of Knaresborough, acres that were strategically positioned directly in the path of the upcoming A59 bypass and regional infrastructure expansion. Local surveyors and district planners frequently commended my foresight, assuring me that the investment would eventually secure our family's financial independence for generations to come. Eleanor used to proudly boast about my professional intuition during Sunday congregations at our local parish church, basking quietly in the social prestige that my commercial endeavors afforded our household. Then, catastrophe struck with the blind, indifferent cruelty of a natural disaster. An aging industrial pipeline, buried deep beneath an adjacent commercial property, suffered a catastrophic structural failure, leaking unrefined crude oil into the subterranean water table long before anyone in the district detected the contamination. By the time regulatory authorities intervened, the toxic plume had already migrated silently across the underground strata, poisoning the soil of my entire acquisition. My 60 acres, the tangible asset into which I had poured every financial reserve, every borrowing capacity, and every waking hour of labor, were instantly frozen under an unyielding, indefinite remediation order issued by the Environment Agency. I was legally prohibited from selling a single square yard, erecting any structure, or initiating commercial development. The land was rendered utterly worthless overnight, yet the legal and financial liabilities remained entirely tethered to my name, draining my resources through mandatory environmental assessments and council taxes while my credit rating plunged into catastrophic ruin. The high street banks, which had once courted my business with flattering promptness, revoked my commercial credit lines without a shred of hesitation. My business partner dissolved our partnership overnight, vanishing into the legal background to salvage what little personal capital he retained. And Eleanor, the woman who had vowed to stand beside me through sickness and health, through prosperity and adversity, underwent a chilling metamorphosis. The affectionate partner who once shared my triumphs vanished, replaced by a cold, critical stranger who no longer viewed me as a husband, but as a severe administrative failure who had personally disrupted her social standing. She never once placed her hand upon my shoulder to ask how I was coping with the overwhelming pressure. She only demanded to know how I intended to rectify a disaster that was entirely beyond human control. The cruelty of my domestic reality was magnified tenfold by our son, Julian, who was then entering his late adolescence. Rather than offering a fraction of understanding as he watched his father fight to keep our family afloat. Julian internalized my financial ruin as a personal injustice directed squarely against his comfort. I shall never forget the bitter afternoon he confronted me in the hallway because I could not fund his anticipated university spring break excursion to the Mediterranean. With the fierce, unyielding entitlement of youth, he accused me of ruining his formative years, screaming that my professional incompetence had stripped him of the lifestyle he rightfully deserved. He looked at me not with the affection of a son, but with the seething contempt of a victim, refusing to acknowledge the sleepless nights and bleeding hands I endured to keep a roof over his head. In his eyes, I was merely the architect of his disappointment, a permanent embarrassment to be tolerated until he could successfully distance himself from my name. Yet, amid the freezing winter of that profound despair, a solitary beacon of warmth and unconditional grace consistently illuminated the darkness. My youngest daughter, Beatrice, who was then a sensitive 16-year-old quietly bearing the silent trauma of our fallen circumstances, never once cast a single stone of blame. While Julian raged and Eleanor withdrew into icy resentment, Beatrice watched me rebuild a meager, honest existence out of the literal ashes of my ambition, taking a humble job driving a forklift at a distribution warehouse off the A1M bypass. Coming home each evening physically battered yet spiritually unbroken. 2 nights after Eleanor's phone call regarding Julian's £12 million triumph, Beatrice quietly walked through my front door carrying a steaming foil tray of shepherd's pie, my absolute favorite, prepared meticulously with a rich rosemary and Worcestershire sauce recipe passed down from my late mother. She did not utter a single, hollow word about financial status, nor did she mention her brother's vast fortune. She simply set the warm tray upon the kitchen counter, reached up to gently kiss the crown of my head, and whispered with that familiar, loving concern, "You are still coughing terribly like that, old man. You must let me look after you." In that fleeting, sacred instant, as the rich aroma of home-cooked comfort filled the drafty kitchen, the glacial ache in my chest melted away, reminding me that true human worth is measured not by the balance of a commercial bank account, but by the quiet, unyielding devotion of a soul who loves you simply for breathing. The physical toll of enduring a decade of financial devastation eventually manifests within the human vessel in the most merciless ways imaginable. Just as the emotional wounds inflicted by my family had begun to scar over into a hard, protective callus, my physical health chose that precise moment to launch its own quiet rebellion. For 3 continuous weeks, a persistent, rattling cough had plagued my chest, a symptom I stubbornly attributed to the heavy diesel exhaust at the warehouse and the persistent dampness of the North Yorkshire air. However, at the quiet insistence of Beatrice, who refused to be brushed aside by my casual dismissals, I finally scheduled an appointment with Dr. Ferris at our local medical practice in Harrogate. The atmosphere within the consultation room was uncharacteristically solemn the afternoon the diagnostic results were finalized. Dr. Ferris did not wear his customary professional smile as he re-entered the room, carrying my file with an unsettling gravity that made my heart hammer painfully against my ribs. "Arthur, I'm not going to soften the edges of this for you," Dr. Ferris stated, his voice low and measured as he set the medical documentation down upon his desk. "The pulmonary mass we discovered on your left lung is malignant. The encouraging dimension of this diagnosis is that it remains localized and fully operable. However, time is an absolute luxury we do not possess. That growth must be excised promptly, within a matter of weeks, not months, before metastasis robs us of our intervention window." There it is, I thought to myself with a chilling internal numbness. The final catastrophe. Very well, I responded calmly, because the human spirit, when beaten down sufficiently by fate, develops a strange, detached resilience. Let us schedule the surgical procedure immediately. That was precisely the moment when the institutional machinery of modern healthcare ground my remaining hopes into dust. The administrative billing coordinator, a sympathetic woman named Becky, entered the office bearing an unexpected financial blow. She informed me, with visible discomfort, that my private insurance policy, downgraded years prior during the height of our financial crisis, contained a severe coverage shortfall for the specialized surgical technique Dr. Ferris intended to utilize. Before the hospital would formally allocate a date within the surgical calendar, an upfront out-of-pocket deposit was strictly mandated, exactly £3,000. No payment plans, no temporary waivers, cash security to guarantee the operating theater. I sat alone in my aging Ford Ranger in the hospital car park beneath a relentless Yorkshire drizzle, calculating the arithmetic across 6 distinct financial scenarios, and every single time the conclusion remained identical. I possessed zero savings. My credit score remained permanently tarnished from the land liabilities, and I was facing a ticking time bomb inside my own chest, separated from life-saving intervention by a barrier of £3,000, while my son, Julian, sat upon an investment portfolio worth £12 million. Desperation eventually erodes even the thickest layers of paternal pride. I dialed Julian's mobile phone, praying against all rational evidence that a shred of human empathy might reside beneath his polished corporate exterior. He answered on the 4th ring, the acoustic background instantly betraying his luxurious environment. The crisp clinking of fine crystal glassware, muffled laughter, and a woman's voice appreciating an expensive vintage single malt. "Dad? Listen, can this possibly wait? We are at a high-end establishment in Leeds, celebrating the acquisition of the corporate account," Julian muttered impatiently. "Julian, I require assistance regarding an emergency medical situation. Dad, I told you repeatedly to stop involving me in your crises. Ask the hospital administration for an installment plan." And with a cold, definitive click, the line went dead. My own flesh and blood severed the connection while I sat freezing in a car park, merely so he could return to his whiskey. When I returned to our Harrogate home and laid the brutal reality before Eleanor, pleading with her to intervene, to remind her son that his father's life hung in the balance, her reaction transcended mere indifference. It was an act of profound emotional abandonment. She did not express a single flicker of alarm regarding my malignancy. Instead, her eyes flashed with fierce, protective fury directed entirely at her son. "Do not you dare place financial demands upon Julian or disrupt his professional trajectory," she lashed out furiously, her voice sharp as broken glass. "He worked tirelessly to distance himself from your failures. If you require financial assistance for your medical whims, Beatrice has a stable primary income. Does she not? Go ask the school teacher instead." She uttered those words with chilling detachment, turning her back on a dying husband without a single ounce of remorse. In that definitive second, looking into the eyes of the woman I had cherished for 31 years, the last remaining thread of marital illusion snapped completely, leaving behind a profound, absolute silence that paved the way for the reckoning to come. The rejection from Eleanor and Julian left an absolute, glacial vacuum within my spirit, stripping away whatever microscopic fragments of illusion I had foolishly harbored about my family. 2 days following that conversation, I arranged to meet Beatrice at a traditional, unpretentious tea room located just off the A61 in Harrogate, an establishment characterized by checkered floral tablecloths, porcelain teapots, and a kind, motherly proprietress named Grace who greeted regular patrons by name. I had originally resolved to keep my medical crisis entirely hidden from my daughter, intending to put on a brave facade, consume a modest toasted tea cake, and allow her to assume that everything in my world was entirely satisfactory. I had convinced myself that I could carry the weight of my impending mortality alone, shielding her young shoulders from the crushing burden of my physical decay. However, Beatrice possessed an emotional intuition that could effortlessly pierce through any defense mechanism I attempted to construct. The moment she walked through the wooden entrance of a tea room and settled into the modest wooden booth opposite me, her sharp eyes locked onto my face, instantly registering the profound exhaustion and despair shadowing my features. She did not waste time with superficial pleasantries or polite inquiries about the weather. Dad, she stated softly, setting her handbag down upon the bench with a definitive, quiet click. You look as though the world has collapsed upon your shoulders. Tell me precisely what is wrong. Right this instant. Her tone carried an unyielding authority that brooked no evasion. And so, swallowed by a suffocating wave of paternal shame, I told her everything. I disclosed the malignant diagnosis delivered by Dr. Ferris, the absolute necessity of immediate surgical intervention, and the institutional barrier of the £3,000 deposit demanded by the hospital administration before they would even allocate a date in the surgical calendar. Most agonizing of all, I confessed that I had reached out to my son, only to be cast aside while he celebrated amidst luxury in Leeds, and that my wife of 31 years had callously instructed me to seek financial charity from her schoolteacher daughter instead. As the full gravity of my words settled over the small table, I expected horror, or perhaps the helpless paralysis of a young woman confronting an insurmountable obstacle. Instead, Beatrice's expression hardened into a quiet, fierce determination. Without a single word of hesitation, she reached purposefully into her handbag, withdrew a plain white envelope, and laid it firmly upon the floral tablecloth. Simultaneously, she rotated her mobile phone toward me so I could read the illuminated screen. A formal digital notification from a high-interest credit union approving a short-term advance, alongside a digital receipt confirming the rapid private sale of her reliable hatchback motor vehicle executed that very morning. Dad, cease talking immediately, she whispered, her voice remarkably steady though her eyes glistened with unshed tears of absolute loyalty. There is £1,500 in cash inside that envelope, representing the proceeds of my car and the credit advance. It is half of the total sum required. I shall secure the remaining balance before the week concludes. Beatrice, no, my voice cracked, the constriction in my throat threatening to choke me entirely. You sold your primary means of transportation? You incurred high-interest debt for my sake? I cannot permit you to sacrifice your independent livelihood for a broken old man. Motor vehicles can always be replaced, Dad, she interrupted gently, reaching across the worn formica table to grasp my trembling hand with a fierce, unbreakable grip, anchoring me to the earth precisely when I was drifting away. You cannot be replaced. You are my father. You spent my entire childhood ensuring I was protected and cherished when the world grew cold. Now it is my turn to protect you. I shall simply utilize public transport for my daily commute to the primary school for the foreseeable future. It is entirely manageable, and frankly, the daily walking exercise would do me a world of good. The protective dam I had meticulously maintained around my emotions for 10 agonizing years abruptly ruptured. Right there in the quiet tea room, surrounded by the gentle hum of conversation and the comforting aroma of freshly baked scones, I broke down completely. I wept openly and unashamedly in front of Grace the proprietress, the afternoon patrons, and my extraordinary daughter, releasing a decade of bottled grief, humiliation, and unmitigated despair. Beatrice did not pull away or look down in embarrassment. She simply tightened her grip upon my hand, offering an anchor of pure, unconditional grace. In that sacred, shattering moment, looking into the eyes of the daughter no one ever praised or valued in social circles, I realized she was the only true wealth I possessed on earth. As I sat there wiping the tears from my weathered cheeks, a solemn, immutable vow forged itself deep within the core of my soul, a sacred promise to the universe. I give you my absolute word of honor, I vowed silently, staring into my daughter's loving eyes. No matter how many years it takes, no matter what mountains must be moved, I shall rectify this grotesque injustice. I will repay every single tear, every hardship, and every sacrifice you have made for me 1,000-fold. I shall restore your life, secure your future, and ensure that you never have to stand alone in the cold again. As I live and breathe, I swear it. The morning of the surgical intervention arrived with an eerie, oppressive stillness, breaking through the horizon above Harrogate in a pale, washed-out hue that offered little comfort to a man facing the absolute threshold of mortality. standing within the sterile, brightly lit preoperative ward of the hospital at 6 o'clock, clad in a flimsy hospital gown that stripped away whatever residual dignity age had conferred upon me, I felt the cold realization of my vulnerability settle deep into my bones. Yet, anchoring me against that rising tide of terror was the unwavering presence of my daughter. Beatrice stood right beside my trolley, her professional teaching cardigans replaced by simple civilian clothes, her expression radiating a fierce, protective courage that completely belied her 26 years. Just as the orderly stepped forward to wheel me toward the double doors of the operating theater, Beatrice leaned in close, capturing my trembling hand within her warm grasp and squeezing it with an absolute, unyielding firmness. "You are going to emerge victorious over this, old man," she whispered softly into my ear, her voice steady and resonant. "I already informed the surgical team that you possess the stubbornness of an unbroken mule, and the consultant assured me that is the finest trait a patient can bring into theater." A faint, watery smile touched my lips, and then the heavy doors swung shut, plunging me into the silent oblivion of the anesthetic. When I finally clawed my way back to consciousness 11 hours later, waking up to the abrasive discomfort of an oxygen tube and a localized agony across my chest as though an iron anvil rested upon my ribs, Dr. Ferris was standing beside my bed, still attired in his blue surgical scrubs. He leaned down, so his words carried clearly over the rhythmic ping of the bedside monitors. "We secured absolute margins, Boris, or rather, Arthur." He corrected himself gently with a professional smile. "The entire pulmonary mass has been excised with complete surgical clearance. You performed remarkably." Discharge followed 4 days later, but returning to my Cold Bath Road residence was an impossibility. Eleanor had not so much as transmitted a digital message inquiring whether I survived the operation, and I possessed zero desire to convalesce in an echoing, hostile house. Consequently, I spent the subsequent 2 weeks of rigorous recovery recuperating on the modest fold-out sofa in Beatrice's compact, single-bedroom apartment situated near the A59 arterial route in Knaresborough. The dwelling was so economically modest that the rhythmic footsteps and television audio of the upstairs neighbor resonated clearly through the ceiling plaster. Yet, within those cramped quarters, every corner radiated the sacred warmth of genuine devotion. Taped meticulously to the surface of her refrigerator by a small decorative souvenir magnet was a detailed municipal bus timetable, marked neatly in her handwriting. Service 4 to 6:40 a.m. Every single morning, long before the sun had fully cleared the Yorkshire hills, my 26-year-old daughter rose in the dark to wait at an exposed public bus stop in the autumn chill. All because she had surrendered her reliable hatchback motor vehicle to secure the 3,000 pounds necessary for my survival, forcing her to navigate an arduous public transport commute to her primary school in Leeds. As I lay upon that pull-out sofa during the quiet afternoon hours, staring at that bus scheduled day after day, a profound, agonizing wave of internal reflection washed over my soul. The stark, irreconcilable contrast between my family members carved deep, bleeding chasms within my heart. Here was my biological son, Julian, residing in opulent comfort, commanding a private investment portfolio worth £12 million, yet viewing his father's mortal struggle as an inconvenient financial nuisance. Here was my wife of 31 years, Eleanor, standing complacently behind her son while calculating how to distance herself from my perceived failures. And there, standing in stark, beautiful opposition to their collective callousness, was Beatrice, a young school teacher quietly enduring physical exhaustion, financial hardship, and daily public commutes, asking for nothing, complaining of nothing, and offering everything she possessed simply to ensure that her broken father drew breath for one more sunrise. Lying beneath that thin blanket, listening to the muffled hum of the traffic outside, my grief crystallized into a quiet, absolute certainty. The true measure of a human soul is revealed only when the safety net of wealth is stripped away, leaving behind solely the naked truth of who remains standing by your side. It was precisely the 16th day, following my surgical procedure, when the predictable rhythm of our quiet sanctuary was definitively shattered by a sharp, authoritative knock upon the front door. Beatrice was away at her primary school in Leeds, navigating her demanding teaching responsibilities, while I was resting slowly in my dressing gown, carefully managing the lingering tenderness across my healing chest wall. I answered the door to find a local postal carrier holding a heavy delivery clipboard, requesting my formal signature for 2 certified dispatches. As I accepted the heavy envelopes and closed the door, a strange, inexplicable chill rippled down my spine, an intuitive premonition that the trajectory of my existence was about to swerve violently. The first envelope bore the unmistakable, formal crest of the Environment Agency, the governmental institution that had held my 60 acres of land in Knaresborough under an unyielding, paralyzing environmental lockdown for 10 agonizing years. With trembling fingers, I tore open the flap, seated myself at Beatrice's small timber kitchen table, and read the official determination twice, then a third time, to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. The text was unequivocally clear: remediation status complete. Site officially released from federal and regional environmental oversight effective July 14th. 10 years of crushing council tax liabilities, 10 years of watching my credit rating languish in absolute ruin, 10 years of enduring my wife's silent contempt as though I were a public disgrace. All of it was formally concluded. The toxic plume had cleared, the soil had naturally purged itself, and the legal shackles binding my hands had been instantly severed, before the profound weight of that revelation could fully anchor within my consciousness. I turned my attention toward the second envelope. It originated from a corporate entity I had not anticipated hearing from, Yorkshire Land and Infrastructure Limited. As I unfolded the heavy bond paper, the financial reality of the modern world struck me with the force of a physical tremor. It transpired that while my property had remained frozen under regulatory restrictions, the long-anticipated 59 regional bypass and municipal infrastructure expansion, the very commercial corridor I had accurately predicted a decade too prematurely, had finally materialized, passing directly adjacent to my eastern property boundary. 60 acres of land that had languished as valueless, oil-tainted marshland were now positioned less than half a mile from a newly constructed, multi-million-pound commercial motorway interchange, perfectly zoned for prime industrial and retail development. The accompanying legal document was not a tentative inquiry or a speculative expression of interest. It was a formal, binding acquisition offer backed by substantial financial guarantees. The corporate purchaser was prepared to execute a 30-day completion window for the outright acquisition of the entire acreage, offering a lump sum cash payment of exactly £12 million sterling. I stared at that numerical figure, £12 million, for what felt like an eternity. Just 3 weeks earlier, I had sat in a modest Harrogate tea room weeping openly because I could not assemble £3,000 to save my own life from a malignant tumor, while my wife and son treated my mortality as an inconvenient nuisance. Now, the dormant earth I had stubbornly defended through a decade of ridicule had yielded a fortune that dwarfed my son's entire corporate portfolio. Yet, as I sat alone in that quiet apartment with the documentation of an immense empire resting upon a worn kitchen table, there was no ecstatic shouting, no frantic pacing, and no triumphant celebration. Instead, an eerie, profound stillness settled deep within my mind, a chilling, crystal-clear tranquility. My gaze drifted slowly upward toward the refrigerator door, landing squarely upon Beatrice's handwritten bus timetable. Service 4 to 6:40 a.m., reminding me of the daughter who had surrendered her motor vehicle so her father might draw breath. In that transformative instant, looking at a fortune that could buy kingdoms, yet realizing its true purpose was far simpler, the bitterness of a decade melted away, replaced by the steely, unyielding resolve of a man who finally possessed the absolute means to balance the ledger of human justice. With the binding acquisition offer from Yorkshire Land and Infrastructure Ltd. resting upon Beatrice's wooden kitchen table, The immediate imperative was to secure professional legal validation before initiating any formal response. I lifted my mobile phone and placed a secure call to Larry Foster, the seasoned solicitor who had navigated my modest business and legal affairs back before the industrial pollution disaster struck our region. Larry remained one of the exceptionally rare professional associates who had maintained an honorable relationship with me after my professional collapse, primarily because I had consistently settled his modest advisory invoices punctually, without a single default, across the most punishing years of my adversity. Foster Legal Services, Larry Foster speaking. His familiar, measured voice came through the digital receiver. "Larry, it is Arthur Pendleton," I stated calmly. "Arthur, goodness gracious, it is genuinely wonderful to hear your voice. Beatrice mentioned that your surgical intervention concluded successfully, but, Larry, I require you to examine some highly complex legal documentation for me today, if your professional schedule permits." I interrupted gently, ensuring my tone conveyed the absolute gravity of the situation. There was a brief, perceptive pause on the line before Larry responded with professional readiness. "What specific matter are we addressing, Arthur?" I laid out the entire sequence of events without embellishment. The official environmental clearance notification issued by the Environment Agency, the sudden commercial rezoning of the acreage near Knaresborough, and the £12 million acquisition proposal tendered by Yorkshire Land and Infrastructure Limited. Larry fell into a profound, breathless silence, sufficient to make me wonder if the digital connection had dropped entirely. £12 million sterling, Larry finally articulated, his voice dropping an octave in sheer disbelief. "Arthur, that completely alters the entire legal and financial landscape of your existence." "I am well aware that it does, Larry," I replied steadily. "That is precisely why I require you to retrieve an archived document from your secure filing systems prior to executing any formal acceptance of this commercial offer." "Which specific document are you referencing? Do you recall a formal legal instrument that Eleanor instructed you to draft approximately 5 years ago?" Larry hesitated, his breathing shifting over the line as his memory scanned the archives. "The property and liability separation deed. The specific structural arrangement Julian strongly advocated for and coordinated on his mother's behalf." "That is the exact instrument," I confirmed. "I wish for you to retrieve it, examine its operative clauses line by line, and recite its exact wording to me. Word for word. Omit nothing. Because if my recollection of that legal drafting, endured during the darkest depths of my financial humiliation, was accurate, Eleanor had not merely insulated herself from my professional setbacks. She had legally executed a comprehensive, binding waiver that permanently severed every conceivable claim to whatever future commercial value might materialize from that land. Larry returned my call precisely 2 hours later. I could distinctly hear the heavy rustle of parchment documentation being turned over on his desk through the receiver. "Arthur, I am reading directly from the operative language of the partition and exchange agreement executed 5 years ago," Larry announced, his voice carrying a mixture of professional awe and profound realization. "Allow me to recite the core clause. Eleanor Pendleton hereby formally waives, releases, and forever discharges any and all present or future marital claims, financial interests, or statutory rights, whether legal or equitable, in and to the real property located in North Yorkshire described herein, including any financial proceeds, capital appreciation, or commercial value subsequently realized therefrom, regardless of the underlying cause." Regardless of the underlying cause, I repeated slowly, letting the phrase echo within the quiet confines of the apartment. "Larry, does that partition and exchange agreement legally signify what I interpret it to signify?" "It signifies precisely what we constructed, Arthur," Larry confirmed, his tone hardening with absolute legal certainty. 5 years ago, your wife sought to shield the family residence, her personal bank accounts, and her private pension assets from potential creditor claims arising from your land liabilities. To achieve absolute immunity, she insisted upon partitioning the marital estate. She assumed the Harrogate family home and her personal accounts as her sole separate property, while legally compelling you to assume 100% ownership of that debt-encumbered acreage in Knaresborough as your exclusive separate property. He paused, letting the full weight of the legal reality settle over the line. It was executed as a fully binding contract the day it was notarized and witnessed by Julian himself. Whatever financial fate befell that acreage, whether it remained worthless marshland or transformed into a £12 million commercial windfall, she signed away every single statutory claim to its valuation, completely independent of whatever circumstances caused that value to shift. A strange, quiet smile touched my lips. Not a smile of malicious triumph, but the profound, detached amusement of a man witnessing the flawless mechanics of cosmic justice. It was entirely Julian's brilliant, arrogant strategy. 5 years prior, driven by ruthless self-preservation and a contemptuous desire to ensure his mother's comfort remained untouched by my supposed financial ruin, Julian had engineered that legal partition. He had convinced Eleanor that isolating the family assets was a masterstroke of financial prudence, ensuring that if the environmental liabilities ever resulted in bankruptcy or asset seizure, my name alone would sink beneath the weight. They had meticulously planned to abandon a drowning man, locking him outside the gates of their security. Yet, in their desperate eagerness to protect themselves from my perceived failure, they had inadvertently constructed an airtight legal vault around the very asset that was destined to bloom into a fortune. By forcing me to assume exclusive, sole ownership of the land as my separate property, with an ironclad waiver covering any future commercial realization regardless of cause, they had legally disinherited themselves before the wealth even materialized. The very cunning, the very calculation, and the very selfishness designed to crush me had turned inward like a poisoned blade, permanently locking them out of a £12 million empire. Sitting there in the quiet stillness of my daughter's apartment, I realized that true poetic justice requires no human intervention. It simply hands the architects of deceit the exact blueprints of their own destruction. With the absolute certainty of the partition and exchange agreement verified by Larry Foster, the immediate imperative was to maintain an absolute, unyielding wall of silence. I made the deliberate, conscious decision to keep every detail of the £12 million land acquisition strictly confidential from Eleanor and Julian. To share even a whisper of this monumental turnaround with them would not only invite premature hostility, but it would fundamentally betray the sanctity of what I intended to construct. Wealth, when revealed too soon to the unworthy, merely acts as fuel for greed. Preserved in shadow, it becomes an instrument of absolute, uncompromised justice. My lifetime of labor had been systematically denigrated. My physical health had been brought to the brink of ruin, and my survival had been financed entirely by the sacrificial love of my daughter. Consequently, every single pound sterling of that windfall was destined exclusively for the only human being who had ever stood by my side when the ledger of my existence read zero. I directed my absolute, unhesitating instructions straight to Larry Foster over the secure digital line. "Execute the transaction, Larry," I commanded with a calm, resonant firmness that brooked zero argument. "Finalize the £12 million acquisition contract with Yorkshire Land and Infrastructure Ltd. within the designated 30-day completion window. Leave no loose ends. Ensure all historic council tax and environmental liabilities associated with the Knaresborough acreage are settled out of escrow, and transfer the net proceeds directly into the designated institutional holdings." Larry acknowledged my directives with professional precision, recognizing that the machinery of corporate and property law was moving with the inexorable force of a tidal wave. Simultaneously, I instructed Larry to construct an impenetrable legal fortification designed to shield my daughter from any future vulnerability. We established a formal, irrevocable trust structured exclusively under Beatrice's sole name, locking away the full net balance of the £12 million estate into a financial instrument that no external claimant, domestic court, or predatory relative could ever pierce, dissolve, or contest. Before a single penny was secured within long-term investments, I mandated a series of immediate allocations to eradicate every trace of hardship from my daughter's life. The very first administrative directive executed that morning involved transmitting an immediate settlement wire to extinguish the predatory, high-interest credit advance Beatrice had secured to fund my surgery, burning that exploitative loan agreement to absolute ashes. Following that, we cleared the remaining mortgage encumbrance on a newly selected, secure residential property development in the Harrogate district, ensuring she would possess an independent, permanent home outright, completely free of debt, long before her new house construction reached completion. Furthermore, we permanently endowed the specialized educational literacy program and tutoring initiative she had long yearned to establish for disadvantaged local children who could not otherwise afford academic support, fulfilling her lifelong aspiration of giving back to the community that shaped her. As the legal instruments were progressively signed, notarized, and sealed over the subsequent days, I experienced an internal transformation that completely defied my previous decades of quiet desperation. There was no triumphant boasting, no desire for public validation, and no restless anxiety. Instead, a profound, unshakable serenity settled deep within my spirit. I spent those quiet afternoons resting upon Beatrice's modest pull-out sofa, reading, pacing slowly to rebuild my physical endurance, or sitting quietly on her small balcony as the autumn sun dipped below the municipal horizon, watching the world move with a detached, peaceful clarity. I possessed the patient, unhurried stillness of a man who understood that human nature never truly changes. I knew with absolute psychological certainty that the moment Eleanor and Julian discovered the commercial potential of that Knaresborough acreage through public registries, they would inevitably come marching toward this modest apartment door, driven not by familial affection or remorse for my cancer surgery, but by the raw, insatiable panic of greed. I sat there in the quiet calm of the apartment, sipping a simple cup of tea, and quietly welcomed the approaching tempest, entirely comforted by the knowledge that the trap had already been set and the door was permanently locked. 8 days following the formal execution and absolute finalization of the irrevocable trust, the predictable tempest I had calmly anticipated finally materialized upon the threshold of my daughter's modest apartment. The afternoon sun was casting long, amber shadows across the linoleum floor when a sudden, violent battering shook the heavy timber entrance door, a rhythmic, aggressive pounding that sounded less like a polite social visit and more like an enforcement raid by local authorities. "Father, open this door immediately. I am fully aware you are residing in there." Julian's voice pierced the quiet interior, elevated, sharp, and frayed at the edges with a frantic desperation I had never previously witnessed. It was completely devoid of the smooth, self-satisfied arrogance he had projected while celebrating corporate bonuses in high-end Leeds establishments. Beneath his booming tone now lurked the terrifying realization of financial ruin. Before I could rise from the small dining chair, Beatrice stepped briskly out from the kitchenette, her professional teaching cardigan wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her facial expression hardened instantly into the exact stern, unyielding countenance she habitually reserved for unruly pupils about to be dispatched directly to the head teacher's office. She wrenched the door open with an authoritative snap. "Would you care to explain for what rational reason you are battering upon my residential door as though you were local law enforcement?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the corridor with razor-sharp precision. Julian unceremoniously barged past her threshold without offering even a rudimentary greeting, his posture rigid and his breathing shallow. Eleanor marched immediately behind him, her arms defensively crossed over her chest, her facial features carved into a mask of bitter, uncompromised hostility. Picture the tableau of absolute moral bankruptcy. My 31-year-old son attired in a heavily wrinkled business shirt with his silk tie loosened at the collar, fine perspiration staining his neck despite the apartment's air conditioning humming at maximum capacity. My wife trailing closely in his wake, embodying the very portrait of embittered entitlement. Neither individual offered a preliminary inquiry regarding my recovery from major pulmonary surgery. Not a single polite word crossed their lips concerning the deep healing incision still tender beneath my shirt fabric. "Dad," Julian snapped, pacing frantically across the narrow strip of hallway carpet. "We need to converse right this instant. No ibachins." Ah, here it is, I reflected internally with absolute calm. Not an inquiry into my health, nor a syllable of remorse for the hospital car park abandonment. Straight to the mechanics of acquisition. "Take a seat, Julian," I instructed quietly, remaining seated at the kitchen table. "You appear on the immediate verge of a systemic cardiac collapse." He refused the offer, his restless pacing accelerating. "I was reviewing commercial property transactions within the North Yorkshire Regional Registries today," Julian declared, his voice trembling with suppressed panic and absolute outrage. "Yorkshire Land and Infrastructure just logged a formal acquisition memorandum. A 60-acre development parcel situated out past Knaresborough. Your worthless acreage, Dad." The Commercial Title Registry flagged a historical restriction because of the asset separation deed Mother executed 5 years ago. £12 million sterling in cash settlement. "You clandestinely disposed of that property behind our backs, did you not?" Eleanor's jaw dropped in absolute shock, her eyes widening in horror. £12 million, Arthur? Is that horrific statement truthful? So that is how their surveillance uncovered the truth, I deduced. Not through any human confession, but through the cold, public machinery of the Commercial Land Registry. It possessed a grim, dark irony. "It is entirely truthful," I responded, maintaining a demeanor of absolute, unruffled serenity. "The commercial transaction achieved formal completion 9 days ago." 9 days? Julian's pitch climbed into a shrill, hysterical register. "You have been in possession of this astronomical capital for 9 days, and you neglected to notify your own flesh and blood? Your primary heir." I studied him with a steady, unblinking gaze before formulating my response. "The last occasion I initiated contact with you, Julian, you were patronizing an exclusive establishment in Leeds celebrating a corporate bonus, while I sat freezing in a hospital car park attempting to calculate how I was going to fund my own cancer surgery. You informed me with absolute clarity that my survival was not your personal concern. Therefore, no, I did not experience a compelling psychological urge to telephone you the moment an auspicious development occurred. That stark observation ought to have pierced his conscience. Instead, it triggered a furious escalation. You deliberately concealed marital and family assets." Julian's index finger jabbed aggressively toward my chest, as though physical intimidation might validate his baseless accusations. "You were fully aware the environmental remediation order was lifting. You knew that land was on the absolute threshold of prime commercial valuation. You forced us to subsist as though we were destitute throughout this entire decade. Mother operated a 10-year-old hatchback vehicle, Dad, a modest commuter car, while you sat silently upon a multi-million-pound fortune, solely so you could hand it all to your preferred, obedient child the moment it yielded a commercial return. He genuinely believes his own fabricated narrative," I thought, watching him rewrite history in real time to suit his greed. Eleanor stepped forward into the narrow gap between the kitchen and the living space, her chin elevated defiantly. "Do not you dare stand there and posture as the injured victim, Arthur. I stood faithfully beside you for 31 years while you dragged this household through financial humiliation with your disastrous property speculations. That capital rightfully and legally belongs to this nuclear family. You are behaving with malicious avarice. You are being vindictive, cruel, and utterly unprincipled." "Utterly unprincipled," Julian echoed, seamlessly finishing her condemnation. "You are acting with extreme economic malice, Dad, and it is frankly disgusting." "Avarice." I very nearly produced an audible, cold laugh at that descriptor. An individual who had denied his own father £3,000 for life-saving surgery was now accusing that same father of avarice over £12 million. "We are not requesting a voluntary allocation anymore," Julian stated, his voice dropping into that low, threatening register characteristic of a man who firmly believed he held absolute supremacy over the machinery of the state. "Mother is filing for a formal, unilateral dissolution of marriage tomorrow morning at the county family court. Irreconcilable differences, deliberate financial abandonment, structural asset dissipation, the complete legal package. My private solicitor is already drafting an emergency high court injunction to freeze every financial account, trust, and asset connected to that land sale until the judiciary determines an equitable 50-50 division. You concealed and dissipated marital assets, Dad. That is not a legal gray area. That constitutes statutory criminal fraud." He slammed his palm flat against Beatrice's wooden kitchen table, the identical timber surface where, weeks prior, she had slid an envelope of savings across toward her father without a second thought. "You're going to become so entangled in complex litigation that you will not retain a single penny by the time we dismantle you. My high-priced legal team will bury you completely. That is my daughter's kitchen table," I thought, casting a quiet glance toward Beatrice, who stood like a silent sentinel by the wall. And he had struck it as though he held absolute proprietary ownership over her life and sanctuary. I observed Julian for a sustained, quiet duration, then shifted my gaze to Eleanor, before slowly rising to my feet, cautious, mindful of my healing ribs, and reaching into the inner pocket of my cardigan to retrieve the instruments of truth. The thunderous echo of Julian's fist striking the wooden table faded slowly into the heavy, suffocating silence of the apartment. Rather than shrinking beneath their coordinated fury or offering a defensive rebuttal, I simply maintained my calm composure. With deliberate, measured slowness, I rose to my full height, mindful of the lingering tenderness across my healing chest wall, and buttoned the lapels of my cardigan with an unhurried grace that exuded absolute authority. The sheer contrast between Julian's frenzied posturing and my immovable tranquility instantly injected an unsettling chill into the room, causing Eleanor to instinctively step back a fraction of an inch. "You wish to discuss high-priced legal representation, Julian?" I inquired smoothly, my voice carrying a quiet, resonant resonance that commanded the entire space. "Let us converse regarding the immutable parameters of the law." I reached calmly into the inner pocket of my garment and withdrew a crisp, professionally bound legal folio, the original partition and exchange agreement drafted 5 years prior. With steady fingers, I slid the heavy document across the polished timber surface directly toward Eleanor, the parchment coming to rest precisely where Julian's palm had slammed moments before. "Do you genuinely recognize this instrument, Eleanor?" I asked gently, my eyes locking onto hers. She lowered her gaze toward the formal title page, and before she had even traversed the introductory paragraphs, I watched the remaining color drain rapidly from her complexion, leaving her skin an ashen, ghostly white. 5 years ago, I continued, my tone dropping into an analytical, instructional cadence. "You and Julian convened a formal conference right here in our district. You were genuinely terrified, consumed by the panic fear that commercial creditors might pursue your private bank accounts and pension reserves on account of my environmental land liabilities. It was Julian's strategic proposal, incidentally, his brilliant legal insight. He assured you it represented absolute financial prudence, explaining that it would shield your personal credit profile if corporate debts ever formally attached to the property." I reached out and tapped my finger lightly against the precise legal clause on the page. "Consequently, you executed this contract. You retained a solicitor to draft a formal partition and exchange agreement. You claimed the Harrogate family home and your private accounts as your sole separate property, while legally compelling me to assume 100% ownership of that dormant Knaresborough acreage and all associated environmental liabilities as my exclusive separate property." I paused, allowing the agonizing realization to seep into their consciousness, because there was no emotional satisfaction in observing their hands begin to tremble. Only the cold, unyielding mechanics of objective truth. Read the operative clause once more, Eleanor. It does not restrict itself to debt liabilities. It explicitly states, regardless of the underlying cause. You did not merely insulate yourself from my professional setbacks. Under English property law, you formally converted that land into my absolute separate property. You executed a binding waiver relinquishing any future statutory claim to its valuation, regardless of the cause, simply to ensure your hands remained uncontaminated by my financial obligations. Your own legal counsel formally advised you, and Julian executed his signature as a witness. Julian's face had turned a pale, sickly shade of gray, his breathing hitching audibly in his throat. Yet, the stubborn arrogance ingrained in his character refused to surrender. That is entirely irrelevant, he snapped defensively, his voice cracking with rising hysteria. I shall still challenge this contract in the High Court. We will overturn it. On what precise legal grounds, my son? I asked, my gaze shifting from Eleanor to lock squarely upon him. Bring your litigation. Retain every commercial barrister in North Yorkshire. But prior to initiating those proceedings, endeavor to explain to a presiding High Court judge how you intend to claim a statutory share of financial assets your mother legally waived in writing 5 years ago, acting upon your explicit counsel. Explain to that same judge your whereabouts on the evening your father required £3,000 for cancer intervention, contrasted with the actions of your sister. The absolute, crushing weight of reality descended upon Julian with the force of an avalanche. His mouth parted, his jaw working silently as his mind raced frantically to find a legal loophole that simply did not exist. In that devastating second, the terrifying magnitude of his own intellectual hubris crashed down upon him. He realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that his own meticulous web of self-preservation, the clever legal stratagem he had bullied his mother into executing to protect their wealth from a perceived sinking ship, was the exact iron cage that had locked them both out forever. His own MO, cunning scheming, had engineered their total, unmitigated disinheritance. The trap was airtight, self-locking, and forged entirely by their own hands. The complete structural collapse of Julian's legal posturing left a heavy, suffocating vacuum within the small apartment, but I was far from finished establishing the architecture of truth. Without breaking my steady gaze, I reached once more into my cardigan pocket and withdrew a second, distinct document, a fresh, official banking statement bearing the official letterhead of a prominent high street financial institution. With slow, deliberate motion, I slid this second sheet of paper across the polished timber table until it rested directly beside the partition agreement, positioning it squarely beneath Julian's trembling hands. Before you attempt to formulate another desperate defense, Julian, I suggest you inspect this exhibit, I stated quietly. It was Beatrice's personal current account statement. I watched as his eyes scanned down the rows of modest transactions until they locked immovably onto the final, bottom summary line. £12.40. That represented the absolute total available monetary balance residing within my daughter's current account at that exact, miserable moment. £12, I repeated, my voice dropping into a register of profound, cutting indictment that carried the weight of a physical blow. That is the entire financial remainder your sister possesses in the world right now, Julian. £12, because exactly 3 weeks prior, while you were patronizing an exclusive establishment in Leeds ordering expensive vintage single malt whiskey to celebrate a corporate bonus, she was forced to surrender her reliable hatchback motor vehicle and secure a high-interest credit advance so her father could secure access to an operating theater. While you were basking in luxury and congratulating yourself on your professional brilliance, your sister was commuting via municipal public bus at 6:40 in the morning through the autumn chill, so she would retain sufficient fuel capital to reach a professional primary school appointment, paying a modest educator salary. I allowed that stark, unvarnished reality to saturate the atmosphere of the room, leaving no space for evasion or excuses. It was the definitive moral balance sheet of our existence, a glaring, inescapable exposure of the absolute ethical bankruptcy that defined my son and my wife. You wish to lecture me on fairness and legal entitlements? I continued, my eyes shifting to encompass both of them in a gaze of unyielding, absolute finality. Let us speak of the moral verdict, then. Here stands the monumental failure of a domestic household constructed entirely upon the shifting sands of transactional utility, mutual convenience, and calculated selfishness. For decades, both of you measured human worth solely through the cold arithmetic of commercial currency and social status. You calculated that a man broken by an environmental corporate disaster was a liability to be discarded, a dead weight to be cut loose from your ascent. Yet, when a ledger was ultimately audited by objective reality, it revealed the most profound truth of human existence. Genuine devotion cannot be purchased, and selfishness will always construct its own inescapable prison. Eleanor stood frozen beside her son, her lips parted in stunned silence, completely devoid of a single prepared retort for the first time across 31 years of marriage. Julian stared down at that humiliating bank statement, his jaw working soundlessly, the arrogant composure that had sustained him for a lifetime utterly dissolved into the hollow panic of a trapped animal. I did not raise my voice, nor did I display any trace of petty triumph. I simply straightened my posture, looked them both squarely in the eyes, and issued the definitive judgment of a man who had reclaimed his sovereign dignity. The irrevocable trust is fully executed. The £12 million estate is securely locked away under Beatrice's sole name, and every trace of financial hazard has been systematically erased from her life. You are both completely, permanently liberated from my supposed failures, just as you always desired. Now, remove yourselves from my daughter's home. Both of you. Immediately. There was no slamming of the heavy timber entrance door. There were no parting threats of litigation, no defiant retorts, and no final defensive insults. Instead, they turned in absolute, paralyzed silence, retreating down the communal hallway and stepping out into the evening air with the heavy, broken posture of individuals who had just realized, with terrifying clarity, that their own unbridled greed had locked them out of paradise forever. The heavy timber entrance door clicked shut with a soft, definitive sound, sealing out the echoes of Julian and Eleanor's disgraced departure and plunging the small apartment into a profound, restorative stillness. The oppressive tension that had saturated the air moments before evaporated, replaced by a deep, resonant calm that felt as though a great weight had been permanently lifted from the foundation of the dwelling. I stood motionless for a moment in the center of the living space, letting the quiet wash over me, before turning slowly to look at Beatrice. She remained standing near the kitchen counter, her arms wrapped tightly around her torso, as though she were still bracing herself against a storm that had suddenly vanished. The fierce, defensive armor she had worn to protect her father had quietly melted away, leaving behind the gentle, exhausted expression of a young woman who had carried an impossible burden in absolute silence for far too long. I walked across the modest room, moving carefully to protect my healing ribs, and gently pulled her into a warm, protective embrace. A quiet, shuddering sob escaped her lips, not of sorrow, but of sheer emotional release as the years of sacrifice, struggle, and unacknowledged pain finally found a safe harbor. "You never have to worry about tomorrow again, my sweet girl," I whispered softly in her hair, my voice thick with emotion. "The debt is paid, the storm has passed, and your future belongs entirely to you." She pulled back slightly, her eyes glistening with tears as a radiant, incredulous smile broke across her face. In that sacred, tender exchange, we both acknowledged the absolute truth of our journey. Her quiet, unheralded acts of devotion, the hot meals the sold hatchback, the cold bus stops at 6:40 in the morning, had not been lost in the void. They had been written into the very fabric of justice, returning to her manifold through absolute safety, financial freedom, and a life unencumbered by the calculating greed of others. As I look back across the winding road that led me from the cold, sterile walls of an intensive care unit to this peaceful evening in Knaresborough, the ultimate philosophical lesson of my existence stands crystal clear. Material wealth and commercial fortunes are profoundly fleeting things. They can be amassed, lost, and weaponized by the insecure, but they can never purchase genuine human loyalty, affection, or a clear conscience. True nobility is never measured by the balance of a corporate bank account or the hollow applause of society. It is forged in the quiet, unyielding integrity of who remains standing beside you when a world has turned its back. The elaborate edifices of deceit constructed by Eleanor and Julian collapsed, not because of my vengeance, but because selfishness invariably breeds its own destruction, carrying within itself the fatal seeds of its undoing. True retribution requires neither raised fists nor petty malice. It is achieved entirely through the serene patience of immutable truth, the unyielding architecture of the law, and the quiet cosmic justice that ensures every human soul reaps precisely what they have labored to construct with the true measure of their character. 10 days following that confrontation, the sun rose over Harrogate in a brilliant, crystalline display of autumn gold, casting a warm radiance across the rolling North Yorkshire hills. My overnight bag rested packed by the doorway, while a brand-new, reliable vehicle sat waiting quietly in the residence parking bay below. Beatrice and I stepped together through the front door of her compact apartment for the very last time, pulling the timber barrier shut behind us with a gentle, definitive click. We did not look back toward the shadows of yesterday. Instead, we walked side by side out into the crisp, luminous morning air, stepping forward into the boundless, peaceful dawn of a liberated life, permanently closing the chapter of betrayal and opening a magnificent new beginning illuminated by the unshakable warmth of unconditional love, absolute justice, and the quiet, enduring grace of human redemption.